Welcome back, and for those who haven't seen my videos before, congratulations on becoming awesome enough to be my materials. Now in this video here, I'm going to be covering some common sense and some a little bit on what should be educational materials about Native Americans as we are coming up close to Thanksgiving, as I am a descendant of both Creek and Cherokee. So, before I begin, now I will cover a good bit of information across various topics. So, if there's something in particular you'd like to see in the future that you see covered in this video, feel free to drop a comment and let us know what that is. So, I'll start off with, as this is getting close to Thanksgiving, I'll start off with the phrase from the Bible. If you know the particular verse that I'm referencing here, feel free to let us know what that is. But as what Christ has said was the last commandment from God, was to love thy neighbor as thyself. Use some common sense. To love thy neighbor as thyself means basically it's the golden rule that's across just about every accepted religion across the world. To be good to other people. That is the golden rule. It's usually what makes a religion an acceptable religion. The Native Americans had faith before the early colonists came over, and they referenced the Creator as the Great Spirit. Now, I've seen some people try to demonize other religions, and that is essentially what they called the Creator. They had a concept of creation that if all of this was here, something awesome must have made it. So when the first settlers arrived, they understood the concept of higher power, of God. They understood that concept. I'll be covering a little bit of Sanskrit or like textile Native American style images, pictures, like they would often even paint them on walls so that other people could see them, and sometimes they actually used the actual symbols themselves. I'll get to that here in a few minutes. Okay, so we're going to use a bit of common sense. What I'm going to show you here first, this is what's called an arrowhead. It's often referenced that this right here is an arrowhead. If someone picks one of these up, that's the acceptable term, called an arrowhead, right? Now, let's use a bit of common sense with this arrowhead. This would not make a very effective tip on the end of an arrow. It just wouldn't. Aerodynamically, this right here would be too heavy. Now, for those who have went through the Indian education program, if your state has an Indian education program, back when they had Indian education programs, you would know that the Cherokee and the Creek both used atlatls. That was their primary ranged weapon before the introduction of firearms. Historically, they used atlatls, which would be something shaped similar to a tomahawk, right? But there'd be like a curve on the end that would allow them to lay a spear across the top and kind of like propel it forward by moving forward like that, right? That motion would propel a nearly spear-lengthed bolt at their target. Now, if you look at this again, knowing that, you would understand that this right here was very likely on the end of an atlatl bolt, like a short spear, that was fired by using a separate piece that would just cup the back of it and propel it forward. Now, the force that could be generated from an atlatl is highly effective. So I'm going to set this aside. This is an arrowhead, or the common acceptable term is an arrowhead, but we know it to be common sense, as this is not what would be used on the end of an arrow. Okay. The primary weapons used in melee for the Creek and the Cherokee, for both of them, was tomahawks, machetes. So this is a tomahawk here. I did a bit of arts and crafts on this. Right? This is just a tomahawk that I picked up at a hardware store. Did some arts and crafts by putting leather here and doing some paint. I put some fur here, and then I put feathers on the end. Just a little bit of decoration. Now both the Creek and the Cherokee, they would use tomahawks. And they also would use, not particularly to the Creek, they would use machetes. Much like this, or this would be a different shape on the back. But this was the common weapon, common melee weapons of the Creek and with the tomahawk with the Cherokee. One of the weapons they had often used was what looked like the back part of a atlatl, like something that could propel their arrows or their bolts forward, right? And also have a chopping end or a slashing end on the back. So it would look somewhere between the end of a atlatl and a machete. And we're going to do a little bit of arts and crafts. If you have a little bit of rust on your machete, you could do a bit of maintenance on it, right, by picking up some sandpaper from the hardware store. And what you want, if you're working with metal, is to get the red or the black. Those usually indicated that it was intended for working on metal, right? And you could use some olive oil. Right? For some weapons maintenance. Right, and you would just keep using the sandpaper and wiping it down until it was completely clean. Okay, now I'm going to move on to some Native American, basically the Native American version of Sanskrit, or it was like paint. Okay, this symbol here would mean big mountain, but it would also mean abundance, as oftentimes on mountains would have very good, very plentiful hunting. Okay, another one, the firebird, or the thunderbird, also represents a good omen and freedom. Next one. The sun. This had a lot of things that it could represent. Good summer, good season, day, long days, prosperity, and even God. Those were fairly simple to tell what they were. This one is a little bit more complicated. It means rain. It also means prosperity. And this right here, the crossed arrows meant friendship. Now, knowing the symbols is one thing, and knowing the culture is a little bit more. The Sanskrit, or the textile, as these would often be what was woven into fabrics, such as the early Native Americans, even prior to the early European settlers, were highly advanced in agriculture as well as in textile. Like, they could weave blankets. So, knowing the culture, though, right, as this right here looks like arrows, right, but it would also look exactly the same as an atlatl bolt if one did not pay attention to the relative size. Now, we're going to talk a little bit by using some common sense here. Now, if you did go to a school in a state where the Indian education program is a requirement by treaty law for anyone of tribal descent to be taught this. If you knew this, these right here were symbols that were uniformed across North America. Every tribe would have known what these symbols right here represented. Every tribe. The culture on the friendship, right? On the friendship was that if someone had laid their arrow on the ground and one of their friends did the same thing, it meant that peaceful relations could continue, like trade and storytelling. That was usually what it meant. And it wasn't just painting it or drawing it on the ground. And oftentimes it would be drawn on the ground if they didn't have one of those particular items, such as an arrow or a atlatl bolt with them. But they would lay them across the ground, like they would take an arrow and put it on the ground. And right there, if someone wanted to do trade, they would do the same with their arrow. They would lay them there. And then they would try to communicate and offer trade. A lot of tribes didn't even have to speak the same language in order to do trading and have peaceful relations. And they did this for a few thousand years, at least, before European settlers had ever came to America. They understood, love thy neighbor as thyself. They understood that even before the Bible. They relatively got along well. Now they were not completely free from the same ordeal that would be found in other parts of the world. They even oftentimes would have war as well. They had a symbol for war. But if you are of tribal descent and you are in one of those states that were required by treaty, required by federal law to know this, and you did not know that, then there's something wrong with the education program. This is basic fundamentals. Basic fundamentals. Using some common sense. Now, if you're an educator and you find yourself just now having to do this, as some tribes are starting to get recognized federally. And that's a whole other deal altogether, and I'll go into that here in a second. Here's what I have here. This is a bit off topic, I suppose, but this is a well-preserved book printed out in the 1950s. This is an education book on teaching Latin. There are other education books out there that were printed around the 1950s that was pretty accurate at the time. There might have been some inaccuracies because they didn't have a lot of time to put all of the information in books in order to honor their treaties. Now, I am roughly 3/8 combination of Cherokee and Creek. Like, the majority of that is from Creek, which would be my father's side. And I mean by lineage. I'm not talking about the blood test that has already proven itself to be highly inaccurate. I have seen some of my blood kin who are of the mothers, and that was a term by Native American. If you are of the mothers, it's irrefutable that you are of that lineage, right? Irrefutable, because it's very difficult to argue against someone being the daughter of the daughter of the daughter of the daughter, because usually where other questions might pop up with of the fathers, of the mothers was irrefutable. And I've seen at least several people who have shown up with those blood tests would show up a 1% or a 2%, when the bare minimum, them being born of the mothers, would be at least 1/16. That would be 1 divided by 16, using some simple math and some simple common sense. Right? Of the mothers is irrefutable. Of the mothers. These are basic terms. Now, some censorship has become some issues here and there across the internet, right? I imagine someone out there might have prayed for some guidance on this, or some help, right? Well, it's very likely that I am either from the distant past or from an alternate dimension. But I recall, I was born in the 1980s. That is easy. It was easy for me to trace my lineage back years ago. Lately online, I've seen even some documents show up inaccurate looking from what I remember, even on education sites. I'll throw out a few examples. There's treaties out there, and I have a good understanding of those treaties, especially when I had read them the first time. See, there is some legal issues that have most definitely popped up recently amongst Creek nations, right? Or various Creek tribes of tribal descent. Now, telling you a little bit about the history that you might have been ripped from and forgotten as it has been passed down, even though it was required by law that this information be taught of the treaties that were previous to the 1800s, because those treaties are still valid, and parts of them are still valid. Now, one of the most recent things was the Creek Nation, the Muskogee Creek winning some sort of court case with the federal government. Now, the history that I remember was, yes, that at one point there was a lot of part black, part Creek, and some Creek that just looked very dark that had to be removed from the state. Now, had to, I don't say that they had to by law, because it was actually against the law that removed them. Right? See, from what I remember from years ago studying all this, and from what I recall from learning these treaties in an Indian education program when they still offered it, was that at one point the state was required to honor those treaties after the Civil War. And a lot of the local politicians did not want to deal with anyone who was remotely black having the right to vote, because by treaty law they could vote for the commander-in-chief of the U.S. according to the previous treaty. They could vote for the commander-in-chief. Those early free blacks already, some of them of tribal descent, had already had the right to vote